He had billions in the bank, a direct line to every newsroom in America, and a god complex the size of Manhattan. So when Holt Vandermeer, the media tech mogul behind the algorithm that controls half the nation's news feeds, announced he was launching a new political think tank, no one blinked. But when he declared on live television that he would debate any rising star who thought they could challenge his vision of America's future, people started whispering one name: Karoline Leavitt, former White House comms director. Sharp as a whip, a political powerhouse in her 20s, and completely underestimated by the man who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. What started as a publicity stunt would explode into a national phenomenon, with one billionaire's empire hanging in the balance and one woman's legacy just beginning. It all started with 7 words that would haunt him forever. "I accept your challenge, Mr. Vandermeer." Holt Vandermeer didn't believe in humility. Not when he had just closed a $600 million deal before breakfast. Not when his face appeared on the cover of Wired, Forbes, and The Economist in the same month. And certainly not when he stood at the podium of the Liberty Global Summit, a high-octane, invite-only gathering of the world's richest minds and most dangerous egos. He wore arrogance like a tailored suit. Custom, charcoal gray, silk lapels. Everything about him gleamed, from his surgically perfected smile to the subtle shimmer of his Italian watch. The crowd of power players ate it up. He smiled, adjusted the mic, and let the silence stretch. He liked to make people wait. Then, without a shred of irony, he said, "America doesn't need more politicians. It needs architects." The room leaned in. "Politicians recycle ideas," he continued. "Architects build futures." There was a low murmur of agreement. Several high-level donors nodded. Someone near the back clapped too early. Holt didn't flinch. He was on a roll. "That's why I'm launching the Liberty Innovation Institute, a new think tank designed to shape the next 50 years of American policy, energy, AI, trade, education. I'm done waiting for slow minds to catch up." Cameras flashed. Live streams surged. "And to prove I'm serious," he added, pausing just long enough to let the suspense ripen, "I'm offering a public debate. One night, national broadcast. I'll take on anyone who thinks they know better, anyone who believes they've got a real vision for the future." He let that hang in the air like a thunderclap. "Anyone." The crowd broke into applause. Loud, quick, performative. They were clapping for the moment, not the meaning. No one thought it was anything but another PR stunt. No one but her. 4 time zones away, in a modest Georgetown office filled with overstuffed bookshelves and half-finished policy drafts, Karoline Leavitt looked up from her laptop and raised one eyebrow. "Did he just say anyone?" she asked, the corners of her mouth twitching. Her communications director, a former Capitol Hill veteran named Tasha, didn't even look up from her phone. "He's grandstanding. Probably expects some tired congressman to take the bait and get steamrolled." Karoline leaned back in her chair. She'd been fielding donor calls all morning, prepping a keynote for a youth leadership summit, and finishing edits on a white paper about AI regulation. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but suddenly she didn't feel tired. "He thinks this is a game," Karoline said, more to herself than to Tasha. "Because for people like him, it always is." The video clip spread like a virus, from business blogs to political junkie feeds to TikTok, where users began pairing it with clips of Karoline's most blistering soundbites from her time at the White House. One TikTok account stitched Holt's smug "anyone" with a clip of Karoline on the debate stage saying, "The difference between a businessman and a leader? One counts dollars, the other counts people." It got 2.4 million views in under 10 hours. Soon, hashtags started trending. Hashtag Let Leavitt Speak. Challenge accepted. Holt vs. Karoline. By the next morning, news anchors were practically begging her for an answer. Will she accept? Could this be the most anticipated political showdown of the decade? Is Holt Vandermeer punching above his intellectual weight? Holt, watching from the private theater inside his Manhattan penthouse, was amused. They're really trying to turn her into some kind of underdog heroine, he scoffed. Cute. He leaned back and popped another olive into his mouth. Set up a podcast tour, he told his assistant. Get me on Rogan, Bill Maher. All of them. Let's blow this thing up. His smile faded for just a second. She won't say yes. She knows better. But Karoline Leavitt didn't know how to walk away from a fight, especially not one that could expose a man like Holt Vandermeer for what he really was, a manipulator dressed in meritocracy. That night, she sat in her quiet apartment, staring at her tablet. Her team had warned her. The risks were enormous. One wrong answer, one bad moment, and the media would devour her. Holt had money, reach, and control over more platforms than she could count. But Karoline had something else. Conviction. She tapped open a blank social post and began typing. I accept your challenge, Mr. Vandermeer. She paused. Let's talk about the future, and let's do it in front of the American people. She hit post. It took exactly 42 seconds for her phone to explode. Within 5 minutes, CNN was running a breaking news banner. Twitter collapsed into chaos. A clip of her announcement went viral before she'd even stood up. In a luxury high-rise across the city, Holt Vandermeer was pouring a drink when his phone buzzed. He glanced down. One line from one of his senior advisors. She said yes. For the first time in years, Holt felt something cold trickle down his spine. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything changed. Not just for him, not just for Karoline, but for the future of power itself. And the man who thought he could outsmart her, outtalk her, outshine her, overwhelm her, was about to realize the cost of underestimating a woman who had already outmaneuvered half of Washington before she was old enough to rent a car. He'd thrown down a challenge. Karoline Leavitt picked it up. And she was going to make him regret it for the rest of his life. In the hours after Karoline's announcement, the political internet fractured into two camps. Those who underestimated her, and those who still underestimated her, but more politely. Isn't she like 25? One cable news pundit scoffed. She's got a ring light and a TikTok, sure, but can she hold her own against Holt Vandermeer? Asked another. They said it the way people used to say, but he's just a community organizer. Or, she's just a girl from nowhere. But Karoline Leavitt had heard it all before. She just smiled. Because the truth, the one almost no one in the media cared to remember, was that she hadn't been handed anything. No legacy connections, no dynastic surname, no billionaire family bankrolling her ambitions. She was born in Atkinson, New Hampshire, a town most people couldn't find on a map without squinting. Her dad drove trucks. Her mom worked nights as a nurse. Politics wasn't something that lived at the dinner table. Bills did, schedules, worries. But Karoline had a habit of paying attention to the way her parents spoke when they thought she wasn't listening. To the local radio station, always buzzing quietly in the background. To the stories that didn't make the news. She was a teenager when she started volunteering for local campaigns, knocking on doors in the snow, organizing voter lists, learning how to spin a policy position into something that made people feel seen. By 19, she had ditched sorority life for campaign buses. By 21, she'd managed social media for a rising Senate candidate and written half his stump speech without credit. It was during a brief internship in D.C. that she was asked, casually at a lunch, "What do you want to do after graduation?" Her answer was immediate. Change the conversation. The man across the table laughed. Not unkindly, just the way people laugh when they think you're adorable. That's a big goal for someone barely old enough to drink. But she didn't blink. So was the moon landing. That one line made its way quietly through the halls of Capitol Hill, from aides to chiefs to press secretaries. By 23, she was working in the White House communications office, crafting the administration's responses during one of the most turbulent media cycles in recent history. She didn't get the senior title or the morning show interviews, but she got results. Policy threads went viral under her watch. Approval numbers ticked up in key demos. She was the ghostwriter behind moments that seemed off the cuff, but were anything but. She became known inside the Beltway as the wrecking ball in heels. Not because she shouted, Karoline never needed to raise her voice, but because every room she entered suddenly stopped being about ego and started being about ideas. But Washington is a place where too much young talent makes people nervous. Eventually, the whispers started. She's too ambitious. She doesn't play the game. She doesn't know her place. That last one stuck with her. So she left, voluntarily, quietly, without fanfare or drama. She moved back north, founded her own communications and policy firm, and began building something they couldn't control, her own platform. At first, the media ignored her. Then they mocked her. Then they realized the mistake. Because while they laughed, Karoline had built a digital following in the millions. Not with gimmicks, with clarity, with conviction. She hosted live streams that broke down complex legislation into language an eighth grader could understand, and people loved it. She didn't scream. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't chase controversy. She just told the truth. And people, especially young people, were starving for it. By the time Holt Vandermeer issued his public challenge, Karoline had already quietly advised 6 campaigns, reshaped public opinion on emerging tech policy, and launched a civic education nonprofit that had signed up over 200,000 student members in under a year. She had been underestimated her entire career, but every doubt they threw at her only made her sharper. Every headline that called her too young, every op-ed that questioned her seriousness, every soundbite that described her as surprisingly well-spoken, it all just added fuel. So when she looked down at her phone and saw Holt Vandermeer's smug face on the screen, barking about anyone daring to challenge his vision for the country, she didn't feel intimidated. She felt invited. Holt didn't understand yet. He thought this was a game of branding, optics, audience metrics. He didn't know that Karoline Leavitt had already beaten men with bigger titles, larger wallets, and longer resumes, not by matching their ego, but by refusing to play their game in the first place. He thought she was a rookie, a talking head, a TikTok politician. What he didn't know was that Karoline had been building to this moment for her entire life. And she had no intention of losing. Not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to protect. Her team, her family, her generation, her country. He didn't see her coming. He never would. And that, more than anything, would become the reason he lost. By the time the press finished speculating and the network stopped spinning, the challenge had morphed into something much bigger than either of them had planned. What had started as an arrogant soundbite and a bold reply had become the event of the decade. Karoline Leavitt versus Holt Vandermeer. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was culture, technology, power, philosophy. And somewhere in the smoke-filled back rooms of Washington and Silicon Valley, the old guard was starting to sweat. Karoline sat in a leather chair in a quiet DC studio. Lights dimmed, a storm of cameras and microphones swirling outside the glass walls. Across the table sat a moderator from one of the big 3 networks. neutral, polished, forgettable. The kind of face you'd seen 100 times and never once remembered. "The public wants to know what this is really about," he said, pressing record. "Can we finally talk stakes?" Karoline nodded slowly. She already knew what he was trying to do. Frame it. Contain it. Package it neatly for commercial breaks and panel reactions. But she wasn't interested in theater. This was about direction. About who got to shape the architecture of the world the next generation would live in. And that wasn't something you reduced to a hashtag. Still, she gave him what he wanted. "It's a debate," she said. "National, town hall format. Broadcast live across every major streaming platform. The public will ask the questions. We'll answer. And the prize?" Her eyes didn't blink. "Control of the Liberty Innovation Institute." The moderator straightened. He hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. "The think tank Holt Vandermeer launched? That's the one. And the loser?" Karoline paused. Not for drama, but to make sure her words landed exactly where she wanted. "Steps down from public life, permanently." The room went still. Even the techs behind the cameras stopped fiddling with the lights. Because this wasn't just a clash of opinions. It was a duel with reputations on the line. One wrong answer, one misstep, one moment of hesitation, and someone's empire would dissolve overnight. Karoline stood. The interview was over. She had work to do. Across the country, in a glass and steel tower overlooking San Francisco Bay, Holt Vandermeer was also preparing. Only his prep looked very different. "Make sure the lighting's perfect," he barked at his media consultant. "Cool tones, underdog vibe." "You're not the underdog," the man replied. "I am now," Holt snapped. "Look at the way they're talking about her. She's got every TikTok pundit rallying behind her like she's Joan of Arc with a podcast." He turned to the digital war room where 5 large screens were displaying everything from voter sentiment graphs to debate strategy documents. "Start tracking every time she mentions regulation, privacy, ethics. Build counter-narratives. Flood the forums. I want her message drowned in noise." He was calm on the surface, but underneath, the panic was starting to throb. Because Holt hadn't expected her to fight back. He thought she'd say no. He thought she'd fade. He thought he could control the terms. But now the terms were real. And the consequences were higher than anything he'd ever risked. He'd never stepped into a battle where he could lose everything. His think tank, his media leverage, even his public credibility. But he'd said anyone. And she had said yes. And now the world was watching. As the debate date drew closer, the rules were finalized. 60 minutes. Live questions from a rotating panel of citizens. No scripts, no aids, no commercial breaks. The venue, the Kennedy Center. A symbolic choice. High art, high pressure, no room for error. Each candidate would have only a single 5-minute opening. Then it was a free-for-all. The topics: artificial intelligence, digital freedom, ethics in emerging tech, and the future of democratic accountability. It was everything Holt claimed to be a visionary about, and everything Karoline had actually been doing work on for years. The nation was divided. Holt's camp painted Karoline as dangerously idealistic. "She's all theory, no real-world weight," they said. "Her version of the future is just a TED Talk with subtitles." Karoline's supporters countered, "He's all empire, no ethics. A man who built a kingdom out of attention and thinks that makes him right." The polls were tight, uncomfortably tight. But one number stood out. 86% of viewers under 30 said they planned to watch live. Holt noticed. "Do we have any viral strategy for Gen Z?" he asked his digital lead during one late-night prep session. "We're working on a parody skit," the guy replied weakly. Something about like AI girlfriends and your avatar? Holt's expression went dark. Scrap it, all of it. Just buy the top trending spots and put my face everywhere. He still didn't get it. He thought the debate was a performance, a tech demo, a branding contest. But Karoline knew better. She didn't want the spotlight. She wanted the leverage that came from telling the truth while the whole world was forced to listen. She met with AI ethicists, educators, civil liberties lawyers, software engineers, even whistleblowers from Holt's own ventures. Her team wasn't prepping her with sound bites. They were loading her with firepower, substance over spectacle, conviction over convenience. Holt had invited her onto a stage. He'd expected applause and control, but what he'd given her was a microphone she planned to use like a sledgehammer. The closer the night came, the more the pressure ratcheted. News cycles, leaks, smears, new op-eds by the hour. Karoline's inbox overflowed with threats. Her team tightened security. Holt's proxies tried to shift the format, shorten the debate, add fact-checkers he could control. She refused. "We're not negotiating over truth," she told her campaign manager. "We're showing up with it." And deep down, Holt Vandermeer knew something was wrong. He could feel it. This wasn't the matchup he wanted. This was the reckoning he didn't realize he'd invited. And when the curtain finally rose, he'd realized just how badly he'd miscalculated. Because the woman standing across from him wasn't there to play his game. She was there to end it, once and for all. The view from the 88th floor of Vandermeer Tower could make you believe in delusions. Sunlight spilled over the Pacific like it owed Holt Vandermeer something. The air smelled like citrus and cold ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the penthouse conference room, casting long shadows over white marble, brushed steel, and billion-dollar egos in tailored suits. Holt leaned back in a black leather chair so soft it might as well have been imported from a cloud. His navy suit looked like it had been ironed by a physics lab. On the table before him, espresso, imported cigars, and a $300,000 tablet with his face on the lock screen. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man reviewing victory papers before the war had even begun. "So she's serious," said Kane Mercer, his head of public strategy. "She's really going through with it?" Holt didn't look up. "She already has." Laughter broke out across the room. "What's her plan?" someone asked, half mocking. "To lecture you to death on civic engagement? Is she gonna quote Lincoln and cry on cue?" said another. Even Kane was grinning now. "The girl's got punch, I'll give her that. But Holt, come on. She's a policy nerd with a ring light. You're Holt Vandermeer. You made the algorithm that made the billionaires." That line made Holt finally look up. "Exactly," he said, his voice low, smooth, practiced. "Which means we don't get sloppy. Just because someone comes in dressed like a school board candidate doesn't mean they can't bite." Still, the mood was light. They didn't fear her. They didn't respect her. They thought they were prepping for a casual exhibition match. Gloves on, cameras rolling, a polite knock to the jaw, and a standing ovation. They didn't realize she was training to bury them. "Here's what we do," Holt said, tapping his tablet. Instantly, the massive screen behind him lit up with data, graphs, heat maps, demographic breakdowns. The digital soul of America laid bare. "Keep the optics clean. I'm not punching down. She wants to play visionary? Fine. I'll frame her as naive, unproven, idealistic to the point of danger." "Too young," Mercer added. "Too green," chimed another. "Too emotional." "Exactly," Holt said, smiling. "Let's let her be the hot-blooded firebrand. I'll be the architect of calm." His comms director, Lita Voss, flipped open her laptop. "We've already lined up a dozen op-eds, economic forums, National Review. Even The Atlantic is interested, if we massage the language enough. Any surprises in her record? Holt asked. Lita shrugged. Nothing illegal, just idealistic fluff. Some unpaid consulting work. A few speeches that make her sound like the lead in a Netflix reboot of The West Wing. She's clean. Boring clean. Good, Holt said. Boring is easy to beat. People want vision, not virtue. He turned back to the window, staring out at the water. For a moment he looked reflective, almost nostalgic. You know, he said slowly, I was her once. The room quieted. 20 years ago, I was pitching tech equity to VCs who couldn't spell ethics. They laughed too. Then they watched me buy their companies. Kane smirked. You're not exactly the underdog anymore. No, Holt said. I'm the market. And markets don't argue. They consume. That was the thing about Holt Vandermeer. He saw the world not in ideologies, not in parties or platforms, but in leverage, market share, audience capture, influence density. He didn't hate Karoline. He didn't even think about her as a person. He saw her as a variable, an anomaly to be solved. I want her speaking schedule, every podcast, every campus visit, every interview, every fundraiser, every dinner with a donor's niece. Map her message patterns, find the tells. We already flagged 5 of her speechwriters, said Lita. 2 used to freelance for progressive outlets. 1 still tweets anonymously. Start a whisper campaign, Holt said without looking away from the glass. Don't push lies, just nudge the truth. Make people wonder who's really writing her lines. What about her followers? Kane asked. She's pulling serious numbers with young voters. Some of her content's outperforming CNN. Holt's eyes narrowed. Then we poison the well, inject noise, flood her tags with parody clips and low-effort memes, confuse the algorithm, mute her momentum. For all his bravado, Holt was not stupid. He knew the real threat wasn't Karoline's charisma. It wasn't even her policies. It was her clarity. She spoke in a way that landed, not because she simplified, but because she respected the people listening. That was the thing Holt's empire had never quite figured out how to engineer. Authenticity. And deep down, it irritated the hell out of him. The meeting dragged on. Staffers debated camera angles and backdrops, soundstage choices and soft focus edits. They planned the perfect lighting for Holt's suit, the pre-written talking points, the spontaneous applause lines. By the time they broke for catered sushi and imported whiskey, Holt had already scheduled 3 influencer dinners, 2 exclusive podcast drops, and a new promo video filmed on the roof with drones. But none of it could change what was coming. Karoline wasn't trying to win hearts with flash or charm. She wasn't trying to win them at all. She was trying to wake them up. And there was no algorithm to stop that. Later that evening, alone in his suite, Holt stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing his closing line. He said it once, then again, then a third time, slower. But no matter how many times he said it, something about it felt hollow. He couldn't explain it, just a whisper in the back of his mind, a feeling, a tremor. Like maybe, just maybe, he'd misread the equation. Not because she was stronger, not because she was smarter, but because, for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't in control of the story anymore. And that terrified him more than he could admit. At first, she said no. Not because she was afraid, and not because she thought she couldn't win, but because Karoline Leavitt knew exactly what this was. A trap dressed as an opportunity. A spectacle built to humiliate her on the biggest stage imaginable. She knew how these things worked. She'd written the playbook for candidates who walked into hostile interviews, who got sandbagged by cleverly edited sound bites, who left the stage to a standing ovation, only to be memed into irrelevance by morning. This wasn't a debate. It was a machine, and Holt Vandermeer was holding the remote. But something strange began happening in the days that followed. The momentum shifted. Not because Karoline shouted louder than him, but because she didn't. She spoke with clarity, with calm, with something that had become rare in politics: conviction without performance. Clips of her explaining data privacy to teenagers in a school gym went viral. Her quote, "If the algorithm knows more about you than your own government, maybe it is your government," ended up on t-shirts. The next morning, Karoline showed up at headquarters before the sun did. She hadn't slept. Not really. But adrenaline had its own kind of fuel. The building was quiet, just the low hum of servers and the flicker of motion sensors catching her shadow. She stood for a moment at the long corkboard wall that had become their living, breathing blueprint for the campaign. Photos, press clippings, quotes scribbled in Sharpie, color-coded strings that stretched like a spiderweb of strategy. And now they needed a new one. This wasn't just a campaign anymore. It was war. And she wasn't about to walk into battle without an army. By 9 a.m., the room was full. Not packed with bodies, but with minds. The kind that made enemies nervous and allies sit up straighter. Tasha, of course, sat to her right. Loyal, unshakable. A comms genius who could turn a typo into a talking point. Next to her was Luis Ramos, an economist who had been writing policy memos since before Karoline could legally vote, and who once rewrote a tax reform plan in a hotel bar during a power outage. But the real surprise was the man sitting across from her, Tom Ellison, former senior analyst at one of Vandermeer's think tanks. Clean-cut, clinical. The kind of guy who looked like he'd once been in the military, or maybe just dressed like it for the discipline. "You sure about this?" Tasha asked under her breath as he opened his laptop. "No," Karoline said, "but I'm sure we need him." Tom didn't smile. He didn't apologize for where he'd come from. He just started talking. "I know how Holt's team thinks," he said, pulling up a live feed of Vandermeer's press coverage. "They're not preparing for a debate. They're preparing for a product launch." Karoline tilted her head. "Meaning?" "Meaning you're not his opponent. You're his A/B test." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "He's treating the debate like a demo. One version of the future, presented in two skins. One male, one female. One messy, one measured. One with emotion, one with control. He doesn't want to defeat her," Tom said, nodding toward Karoline. "He wants to absorb her, make her the interesting idea that proves his practical one correct." Luis muttered something in Spanish that didn't need translating. "So what's the move?" Karoline asked. Tom looked at her directly for the first time. "You don't play the demo." For the next 6 hours, they built a plan. No scripts. No over-rehearsed zingers. No fake applause lines or memory-hold catchphrases. This wouldn't be a debate. It would be a recalibration. A redefinition of what leadership sounded like in the age of deep fakes, black box algorithms, and lobbyist-run legislatures. They broke the prep into 3 units. Unit 1. Substance. Policy first. Nothing hollow. Luis and a pair of legislative analysts, one from the education sector, one a healthcare technologist, dived into every angle of the debate topics. AI governance, tech monopolies, data sovereignty, voting tech, ethical frameworks, public interest computing. They simulated questions, ran mock town halls. They tested answers not for flair, but for friction. Karoline had one rule. If it sounds like a slogan, kill it. Unit 2. Media armor. Tasha led that charge. She knew how narratives twisted in the digital echo chamber. Every sentence Karoline spoke would be clipped, memed, and fed through 1,000 agendas. So she taught Karoline to break the format. "Don't give them clean cuts," she said. "Give them substance so dense they have to contextualize it." Karoline practiced breathing under fire, literally. They blasted lights, cameras, sound effects, even hecklers. They rewrote talking points into layered frameworks, so even when someone tried to take her out of context, the argument still stood. Unit 3, Counterintelligence. That was Tom's specialty. He knew how Vandermeer's team operated. The research leads, the op-ed plants, the viral whisper accounts. "They'll try to drown you in subtle smear," he warned. "Not lies, questions. Like, is she too idealistic for real policy? Or, is she anti-progress because she wants guardrails on AI? Or, if she's so independent, why is her funding base so clean?" Tom had answers for all of them. And Karoline didn't memorize those answers. She understood them. That was the difference. By the second week, they were running full simulations, a rented theater, dozens of volunteer audience members with real questions. No rehearsals, no second takes. Karoline stood under the harsh glare of stage lights, every inch of her posture under scrutiny, and answered for an hour without breaking stride. After one session, a college student in the back stood up and said, "You're not like the others." Karoline smiled. That's the point. She spent nights reading obscure case studies, listening to podcasts about the ethics of synthetic biology, rereading the Constitution with annotations from legal scholars. Her highlighter bled through pages. Every morning, she woke up exhausted and electric. Because something had shifted. This wasn't just about Holt anymore. This was about legacy, voice, direction. It was about whether the future would be engineered by the most powerful or shaped by the people who actually lived in it. Holt's camp caught wind of the prep. They leaked footage of her team entering a law school after hours. "She's being coached," one tweet read. "She's not authentic," another said. "She's rehearsing like a presidential candidate." Karoline's reply, "Damn right I am." Because democracy wasn't a TED Talk. It was work. And if they thought preparation made her weak, they weren't ready for what came next. Back at headquarters, Tom pinned a new phrase on the strategy board in thick red letters. "Clarity wins." They stared at it for a moment, a simple truth in a sea of spin. And Karoline Leavitt, small-town daughter, former comms ghost, underestimated once again, was about to prove it on the biggest stage of her life. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The producers had promised a split schedule. Separate interviews, staggered times, different green rooms. That's what Karoline had been told when her team agreed to the appearance. A quick 15-minute sit-down with a centrist news anchor, a few softball questions about her upbringing, and maybe one headline quote about the upcoming debate. Easy, controlled, contained. But nothing about Holt Vandermeer was ever easy, controlled, or contained. And as Karoline sat in the makeup chair, powder brush tapping against her cheekbone, Tasha burst through the dressing room door with her phone in the air. "They just bumped him up," she said. Karoline looked up. "What?" "He's going on right before you. No commercial break, no reset. They're putting you both on the same segment. It's already in the teleprompter." Karoline didn't blink. She just set down the coffee she hadn't touched and stood up. "Was this planned?" she asked. "Oh, 100%, Tasha said. "They want the fireworks. A free preview before the real fight." Karoline turned to the mirror, adjusted her collar, and pulled her hair back tighter. "Good," she said. "Let's give them a show." They walked to the edge of the stage together, crew members whispering, cameras moving into place. The crowd, half live audience, half paid reactions, buzzed with anticipation. And there he was, Holt Vandermeer, already seated in the center chair, already smirking. He looked exactly the way he wanted to, relaxed, confident, expensive. Like the room belonged to him, like the lights were rigged to find his good angles. Karoline took her seat one chair over, her posture straight, her eyes steady. The anchor began his introduction. Two names dominating headlines. One, a billionaire tech visionary. The other, a rising political force with a growing national movement. We didn't plan to have them together, but sometimes fate gives us a preview. Karoline didn't even flinch. Holt let out a low, practiced chuckle. "Let's get right into it," the anchor said. "Mr. Vandermeer, why is your vision the right one for America's future?" Holt leaned forward, hands steepled. "Well, it's not about my vision. It's about measurable outcomes, scalable solutions. I build things that work. Our systems are broken because we keep electing people who talk like it's 1962. Karoline's a compelling voice, no doubt. But if we want to compete globally, we need infrastructure, not inspiration." A few audience members nodded. Holt smiled. Karoline waited for the silence. Then she turned to the anchor. "Can I respond?" The anchor looked surprised. "Of course." She nodded once, then locked eyes with Holt. "You say it's not about your vision, but the institute you're building has no oversight, no public transparency, and is staffed with your former employees. So, respectfully, if it walks like a monopoly, talks like a monopoly, and consolidates political influence like a monopoly, it's probably your vision." A soft "ooh" rippled through the crowd. She wasn't done. "And as for building things that work, sure. You've optimized how we click, scroll, and buy. But you've never built anything that listens." Holt raised an eyebrow. The smirk cracked. Karoline turned to the anchor. "You asked him what makes his vision right. I'd ask, right for whom? Because power without accountability isn't innovation. It's empire. And we've seen what happens when empires go unchecked." The studio went still. Tasha, backstage, nearly dropped her phone. One of the lighting techs whispered, "Holy." The anchor stumbled for a second, then recovered. "Mr. Vandermeer, your response?" But Holt was blinking too much now. His smile looked thinner. "That's a nice soundbite," he said finally. "But we don't need another idealist with a microphone. We need someone who understands systems, scale. I've built platforms that reach billions. That's not empire, it's access." Karoline tilted her head. "Access to what?" Holt faltered. "I'm just saying. Because scale without responsibility is just faster failure. And your platforms, Mr. Vandermeer, have accelerated disinformation, undermined elections, and monetized division. That's not access. That's extraction." She said it calmly, precisely. No anger, just surgical truth. The kind that leaves bruises. The kind that rewrites narratives in real time. The internet felt it instantly. Clips of the exchange hit Twitter before the segment even ended. One user clipped her line, "You've never built anything that listens," and set it to music like a trailer. Another dubbed her the new school Alexandria Hamilton. Within an hour, #Karoline crushed it trended globally. On Reddit, a thread exploded. "Vandermeer just got dismantled on live TV. She didn't raise her voice, didn't interrupt once, and still made him look like a PowerPoint with a bank account." By midnight, someone had already made merch. Karoline didn't celebrate. She sat quietly in the green room, sipping now cold coffee, watching the segment replay. "Did I go too far?" she asked Tasha. Tasha laughed once, hard. "You didn't go far enough." But Karoline knew what came next. Holt wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He'd underestimated her and paid for it with 1,000 viral clips and a dip in polling. But now he would recalibrate. Because Holt didn't care about embarrassment. He cared about control. And losing it, even for a moment, was something he'd never tolerate. Back in San Francisco, his team was already spinning the footage. She was overly rehearsed. She refused to answer a direct question. She attacked him personally instead of offering solutions. But none of it landed. Because the public had seen it live, unfiltered, unedited, undeniable. Karoline Leavitt had walked into Holt Vandermeer's arena and taken the stage from him. And now, the real debate hadn't even started. By morning, the clip had 100 million views. Not just likes, views. It was everywhere. Every phone, every feed, every screen. Karoline Leavitt, calm as a scalpel, slicing through Holt Vandermeer's empire with 2 sentences and no raised voice. "You've never built anything that listens. Power without accountability isn't innovation, it's empire." Those words detonated across the internet like a firework factory going up in flames. The moment wasn't just viral, it was generational. TikTok had already stitched her face into slow-mo edits. Twitter threads dissected her syntax like scholars poring over ancient texts. Instagram flooded with clips of her walking off set, unbothered, silhouetted in studio lights like she'd just dropped a mic that didn't exist. Gen Z didn't just like her, they claimed her. "She talks like we think," one video said, racking up 4.2 million likes in 12 hours. "She doesn't sell ideas, she defends them." And this is what intelligence without ego looks like. The edits got more creative by the hour. Someone synced her debate lines with orchestral Hans Zimmer music. Someone else edited a side-by-side of Holt's expression, fading from smug to stunned, labeling it "The Collapse of Confidence, a study in 5 frames." And then came the merch. Within 24 hours, you could buy hoodies that read, "I build things that listen," and mugs stamped with her now iconic rebuttal, "It's not access, it's extraction." Even schools got in on it. A teacher in Wisconsin started her current events unit by playing the clip. A debate club in Queens renamed their finals the Karoline Round. The moment had ignited something much bigger than a talking point. It had tapped into a collective fatigue. People were tired of corporate doublespeak, of overproduced tech solutions to problems no one asked to be solved, of billionaires deciding what freedom should look like. Karoline hadn't just offered an alternative. She'd exposed the illusion. And that illusion had Holt Vandermeer's face on it. Back at Vandermeer HQ, the vibe had shifted. The usual polished calm was replaced by a kind of organized panic. Staffers moved faster. Emails came with 10-word subject lines and 5-word responses. "No, we can't ignore it." "Get me Joe Rogan." "Has she published anything long-form?" "Suppress the memes." "Did Lita post that apology yet?" Holt watched it all unfold from his 88th floor office, face lit by 5 screens showing 5 different versions of his downfall. CNN played the full clip. Fox showed it once, then pivoted to a smear. MSNBC added a chyron. "Leavitt outclasses Vandermeer. Is this the Gen Z moment?" And then came the polls. A jump. Not huge, but enough to change the room. Karoline's favorability with likely voters under 30, up 19 points in 48 hours. Among independents, up 12. Among women, up 15. The most searched term in America wasn't Holt Vandermeer debate. It was, "Who is Karoline Leavitt?" Holt stared at that search bar like it was an accusation. "She's not even running for anything." he said to no one in particular. "What the hell is happening?" Kane Mercer, looking more rumpled than usual, cleared his throat from the corner. "She embarrassed you, Holt. On camera. In real time." "She didn't win," Holt snapped. "She performed. She got lucky." "It's not about winning anymore," Kane said. "It's about narrative." But Holt wasn't listening. He'd gone quiet again. Still. The same posture he had when he was plotting something irreversible. Tasha, back at Karoline's headquarters, was trying to keep a lid on the chaos, but the floodgates had opened. Donors called. Influencers wanted interviews. A-list podcast hosts were fighting over who'd land her first sit-down. One late-night host had already aired a parody sketch where Karoline was played by a stoic superhero and Holt was a malfunctioning robot in a $12,000 blazer. "This is not normal," Tasha muttered as she watched a Saturday Night Live spoof get 3 million views before breakfast. Karoline didn't seem fazed. She was already back in the briefing room, reviewing AI policy notes and double-checking citations for a blog post she was drafting herself. No ghostwriters, no consultants, just her, the facts, and the responsibility that came with being taken seriously. "I don't want to be a meme," she said quietly, flipping through annotated case law. "I want to be a mirror." Tasha looked up. "To what?" Karoline didn't even pause. "To what they forgot this country could be." By the end of the week, things had changed. Subtly, but permanently. The press stopped calling her a former comms director. Now they called her a rising national voice. Some called her the conscience of the next generation. Others just said, Karoline. Like she was an idea now, a symbol, a warning. And Holt? He tried to pivot. He released a blog post titled, "Let's Talk About Ideas, Not Insults." It was long, cold, clearly written by committee. He launched a new ad campaign, black and white, close-up shots of his face, set to soft piano music, talking about leadership in a divided world. It tanked. The comments were merciless. "Did ChatGPT write this? Still not listening, huh? Give it up, Holt. She already won." But the biggest blow came not from polls or parodies, but from silence. For the first time since his rise, Holt's words didn't move the market. They landed, then disappeared. No impact, no momentum, just echoes. Because the people had found a voice that didn't feel manufactured, and her name was Karoline Leavitt. They couldn't beat her on substance, so they came for the shadows. Holt's team had been quiet for nearly a week after the face-off. Too quiet. While the world reposted Karoline's words and wore them on hoodies, while young voters registered in record numbers citing her as the reason, while think tanks scrambled to adjust their policy language to sound more like hers, Holt had been still, not retreating, reloading. The attack campaign began on a Thursday morning with a whisper. A throwaway headline buried in a low-tier blog known for laundering corporate narratives into digestible outrage. Karoline Leavitt, the mask behind the message? At first, it looked like noise. A few cherry-picked social media posts from her college years, a misattributed quote from a group project, even an awkward photo of her at a costume party freshman year. Nothing damning, nothing criminal. Just enough to start a question. By noon, the right-wing blogs had picked it up. By 2 p.m., cable news was running a split screen. Her viral quote on one side, and her face next to the words, "hypocrite?" on the other. Then came the op-eds. She speaks about accountability, but what about her own? Leavitt says she's different. So why does she sound like every ambitious climber before her? Is Karoline Leavitt too polished to be trusted? It was textbook. Death by implication. Facts weren't needed, just repetition. Just enough digital sludge to gum up the works, to make the viewer pause before hitting share. The message was clear. If they couldn't stop her rise, they'd make sure it was noisy, muddy, and painful. Karoline's phone started buzzing non-stop. Campaign donors were getting jumpy. Reporters called with just a few clarifying questions. Supporters DM'd her screenshots of fake quotes spreading like wildfire. Back at HQ, Tasha stormed into the strategy room with a tablet in one hand and her jaw locked tight. "They're rolling out Phase 2, she said. Luis looked up. "That was Phase 1? Tasha nodded grimly. "This morning was the warm-up. Tonight, they're dropping a full opposition dossier. Anonymous sourcing. Leaked internship emails. Probably a mischaracterized staff report from her White House days. We'll be playing whack-a-mole all week." Tom, seated in the corner, said nothing. He just pulled up a private feed on his laptop. Lines of code blinked across the screen. Search traffic patterns, ad targeting signals, bot cluster movements. "It's not just organic," he said. "They've activated a full dark PR network. Holt's throwing real money at this." Karoline stood at the whiteboard, quiet. Then she picked up a marker and wrote 4 words. "We fight with facts." No deflection, no denial, no drama. "We answer it all, head on," she said, turning to face them. "We show people what accountability actually looks like." The team got to work. By the time the dossier dropped, 6:42 p.m. Eastern, Karoline's full rebuttal page was already live. Every claim, every spin, every cherry-picked quote. All of it countered with timestamps, context, and her own written responses. No handlers, no legalese. Her tone was calm. Her words plain. She didn't flinch. "Yes, I interned for a senator who I later disagreed with. Yes, I made mistakes in college. I also learned from them. Yes, I once called for restraint in regulating AI, before I saw the models now shaping our children's minds." Then came the final paragraph, short, surgical, unapologetic. "This is what growth looks like. If you want leaders who've never made a single mistake, keep electing cowards. I'm not perfect. I'm just not hiding." It hit harder than any headline, because she didn't run from her past. She explained it, and that was something voters hadn't seen in a very long time. Within the hour, her statement had been shared by educators, veterans, working moms, young activists. Someone even turned it into a spoken word poem set to minimalist piano. And the pushback began. "This smear campaign proves her point," one journalist tweeted. "She threatens the powerful, so they're trying to reduce her to a clickbait headline." Even critics who didn't agree with her policies admitted it. Karoline wasn't just surviving the onslaught, she was flipping it. And Holt? He was livid. "This isn't how it's supposed to go," he growled, pacing his penthouse like a tiger in a cage made of glass and ego. She was supposed to fold. "She's not folding," Lita Voss replied from behind a tablet. "She's gaining traction, especially with young voters." "Then hit her again." "With what?" "She just neutralized the entire smear operation in 4 hours." Kane Mercer sighed, rubbing his eyes. "We could go personal." "No," Lita snapped. "If we cross that line, we make her a martyr." "She already is," Holt barked. "They're quoting her like scripture. You saw the TikTok? Some kid literally carved her quote into a skateboard. This isn't politics. This is mythology." But the damage wasn't one-sided. Inside Karoline's team, the pressure was mounting. Sleep was scarce. Every social post required triple confirmation. Volunteer inboxes were flooded with both fan mail and death threats. Tasha caught Karoline late one night alone in the strategy room, staring at the corkboard wall. "You okay?" she asked. Karoline nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Just tired of being told that truth needs a filter." Tasha sat beside her. "You don't have to keep going like this." Karoline looked over. "Yes, I do." She paused. "Because the minute we let them redefine us, we lose more than a debate. We lose the idea that courage can survive in public life." The next morning, Karoline released a live stream. No glam, no production. Just her in a hoodie, in her apartment, with a mug of tea and tired eyes. She spoke for 17 minutes, uninterrupted, about what it meant to be targeted, what it meant to stand up anyway, and what it would take to fix a system built to discourage exactly that. And then she ended with a simple line. "If they think this'll make me quieter, they don't know me at all." The comments poured in. So did the donations. And somewhere, watching from the shadows of his crumbling campaign strategy, Holt Vandermeer realized something terrifying. He hadn't created a controversy. He'd created a cause, and it had Karoline's name on it. The silence between the attacks was louder than the noise itself. After the smear campaign failed to bury her, Karoline expected the usual media recoil, the cleanup, the spin down, the temporary retreat to find new angles. But what followed was stillness. Too quiet. Too calculated. The coverage didn't stop. It just changed shape. No more hit jobs. No more wild accusations. Just a subtle shift in tone. Interview requests were suddenly rescheduled. Opinion columns became softer, less curious. Hosts who had once gushed about her clarity now referred to her in past tense. She had a moment. She was a flash. She might have peaked. It didn't feel like backlash. It felt like quarantine. And that's when Karoline knew something was off. This wasn't just about Holt Vandermeer anymore. It was bigger. She noticed it first during a scheduled university town hall in Chicago. It had been planned for months, a sold-out event hosted by a local student-led policy group. 2 days before the event, the university pulled the plug, citing security concerns, which sounded plausible, until she learned that the same venue had hosted a former congressman just the week before, with zero incident and half the turnout. Then her podcast distributor quietly deplatformed 3 of her episodes, citing algorithmic irregularities. Sponsors withdrew. Revenue dipped. Then dipped again. That same week, YouTube froze monetization on all her content. No strikes, no flags, no real reason. Just silence. Hushed emails. Vague explanations. The digital equivalent of being locked out of your own house. It wasn't censorship. Not on paper. It was something smarter. Isolation. Tasha was the one who finally said it out loud. "This isn't bad press, Karoline," she said, tossing her phone down on the conference table. "It's infrastructure. Somebody's pulled the levers. They're turning down the volume until you disappear." Karoline leaned back in her chair, her mind already 3 steps ahead. "If it's infrastructure," she said, "then we're not dealing with a media problem." Louise frowned. "Then what?" She stared at the whiteboard, half covered in red marker quotes and polling numbers. A network. They started digging. It wasn't hard to find the threads, just hard to believe how many were connected. Funding for the university that canceled her event? A tech philanthropist who'd partnered with Vandermeer on AI advisory boards. The media group that delayed her interviews? Owned by a holding company tied to 3 major private equity firms, all with board members who sat on panels sponsored by Holt's think tank. Even the podcast distributor? Quietly acquired 6 months ago by a firm with indirect but traceable links to one of Holt's shell ventures. And those were just the names on paper. There were others. Names that didn't appear in filings but echoed in conversations. The same hedge fund manager quoted in 3 separate articles. The same cybersecurity expert cautioning networks to vet their digital guests more carefully. Whispers, hints, nudges. Karoline wasn't being silenced by volume. She was being strangled by networks, by those who could rearrange reality without ever raising their voice. She sat in the corner of the office one evening, staring at the matrix of connections Tasha had mapped across a wall. "They're not afraid of what I say," she murmured. "They're afraid of how clearly people hear it." And that's when the messages started coming. Quiet at first, private. One was from a former journalist at a major outlet. "You're right. They froze the profile we were working on. Editor wouldn't say why, but you didn't imagine it." Another from a current congressional staffer. "You should know there's talk of pressuring your donors. Some are getting calls." And then one that made her stop cold. A simple email. No subject line. Just a single line of text. "They're calling you a destabilizer in the private policy briefings." Tasha, reading over her shoulder, looked stunned. "Destabilizer?" she said. "Like you're a hurricane or a threat vector." Karoline stared at the screen, her face unreadable. "I'm not destabilizing," she said quietly. "I'm clarifying." But someone, somewhere, had decided that clarity was a threat. And yet, just as the walls were starting to close, new doors began to crack open. Unexpected ones. The first call came from an unlikely ally, Jamison Clark, a retired senator once known for being rigid, corporate-aligned, and terminally centrist. He'd never once praised Karoline in public. Now, he was requesting a meeting. She took it. They met in a quiet back booth at a small seafood place in D.C., the kind where no one asked questions and the waiters pretended not to listen. "You've pissed off the right people," he said without preamble, cutting into his trout. "Good." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "You hated my position on corporate lobbying." "I did," he said, chewing. "Still do. But you're not wrong about the game. It's gotten too quiet, too sterile. People like Vandermeer don't need to run for office. They own the offices." She waited. "I'm not here to endorse you," he continued, "but I've still got friends who believe the system can be salvaged. They want to help. Quietly." He slid a folded note across the table. She didn't open it until later. Inside were 8 names. 4 sitting legislators, 2 corporate whistleblowers, and 2 tech executives she'd been trying to meet for months. And they weren't the only ones. A week later, a private email came from a former senior engineer at Holt's company. "You don't know me, but I know you're right. I can't go public, but I can show you what they're hiding. It's worse than you think." The tide was shifting. Not in waves, but in ripples. Karoline had entered the storm expecting noise. What she found instead was a vacuum, a carefully engineered silence, maintained by men who thought they owned the future. But the future had a different plan. Because truth, even whispered, still echoes. And now those echoes were multiplying. Not everyone in the halls of power agreed with her, but more and more of them were deciding something even more dangerous. They respected her. And that meant Holt Vandermeer wasn't just losing control of the narrative, he was losing control of the map. It unraveled faster than anyone expected. The night before the final debate, the campaign war room wasn't humming with confidence or layered in quiet resolve. It was chaos, and not the productive kind. Half the team was shouting. The other half had gone silent. The screens on the wall flickered with polling updates, strategy docs, last-minute press requests, and one new headline that hit like a punch to the ribs. Leavitt's allies linked to ethics scandal. The article was thin on fact and heavy on insinuation. A former intern of one of Karoline's advisory board members had made a vague complaint about mishandled funds from years earlier, nothing remotely connected to Karoline herself. But that didn't matter now. It had a photo of her face, a headline built for fear, and the timing couldn't have been more surgical. Luis slammed his laptop shut. This is coordinated. Same reporter that leaked the fake podcast quotes. This isn't journalism, it's a hit job. Tasha paced in a tight loop by the whiteboard, rubbing her temples. We prepped for sabotage, but not this kind. The optics are too clean, too well-timed. Tom didn't even look up from his laptop. He was scanning dark web chatter, forum signals, and ad tracebacks like a code breaker during a war. They're using proxy servers to bury real-time search results, he said. You try to Google Karoline's platform, you get 4 pages of noise. They're drowning us with digital exhaust. I say we pull out of the debate, said one junior staffer near the edge of the room, voice hesitant. Delay it a week. Regroup. No, Tasha snapped, spinning toward him. That's what they want. We step back now, we don't get back up. But if we walk in there tomorrow, and this is the narrative, if the first question is about a fake scandal, and Karoline has to spend 10 minutes defending someone else's mistake, we lose the window. The whole country's watching. We'll burn the moment. Silence. All eyes turned toward Karoline. She was sitting at the end of the table, hands folded, face calm. But her eyes, those sharp, quiet, storm-predicting eyes, were not calm. They were searching, calculating, trying to solve a problem that kept shifting just out of reach. I've worked my whole life to be heard, she said finally. And now I'm wondering if the mic was wired to explode. Tasha moved closer. Karoline. She stood, slowly, quietly. I'm not afraid of Holt, not even of losing. But if the debate becomes a circus, if they drag everything we've built into the same pit they're wallowing in. She shook her head. What's the point? She walked to the window, looking out into the dark DC skyline. Red lights blinked on towers. The city pulsed like a sleeping machine. I've told the truth. I've stayed steady. I've never faked it. Not once, she said. But maybe that's not enough anymore. Maybe it never was. Nobody knew what to say, because nobody could say the one thing that mattered. That maybe, just maybe, she was right. And then her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It was late. A number she didn't recognize. Area code 603, New Hampshire. She stepped away from the table and answered anyway. Hello? The voice on the other end was soft, worn, familiar. Karoline Leavitt? Yes. My name's Mike Sorrento. You probably don't remember me, but I taught you civics back in high school at Timberlane. Karoline froze. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade. That respect isn't reserved for the rich. That dignity doesn't come with a seat assignment. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing flashy at all. The woman in the leather jacket learned it. The flight attendant remembered it. The woman with the car seat felt it. The world watched it. And slowly, one interaction at a time, those lessons spread. Because you don't have to be famous to be kind. You don't need a movie deal to change someone's day. You just have to notice the people around you and choose to see them. That's what Keanu Reeves did. Not just once, not just on a plane, but over and over. When no one was looking and when everyone was. The same man, the same heart. And maybe that's the real story. Not the viral moment, not the headlines, but the quiet revolution of respect. The ripple that starts when one person steps back, lifts a bag, makes eye contact, and says with their actions, "You matter too." So the next time you find yourself in line, or sitting next to a stranger, or faced with the chance to be kind instead of first, remember him. Remember that you don't need permission to be a better version of yourself. You just need a moment. and a choice. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we all get somewhere worth going. Thanks for watching. If this story reminded you that kindness is still alive and well in the world, go ahead and tap that like button so we can keep these good stories moving. Share it with someone who might need a lift today. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that'll make you believe in humanity again. And hey, if you've ever had a stranger's kindness change your day, tell us in the comments below. You never know who's reading or how far your ripple might reach. Louise exhaled, almost smiling. Back to clarity. Back to purpose, she said. We show the country that being honest doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous to the people who've made careers off lies. Tasha grinned, fire back in her eyes. What do we lead with? Karoline picked up a marker and wrote it across the whiteboard in huge, bold letters. They built a system to silence people like me, and I showed up anyway. The room erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, in motion. Fast, focused, fearless. They had 12 hours to prepare, and now they had their voice back. The auditorium was a cathedral of silence before it exploded. Red curtains, cold lights, rows upon rows of seats filled with journalists, students, lawmakers, CEOs, veterans, mothers, skeptics, believers, all of them holding their breath, all of them waiting. It was debate night in America, and for the first time in years, it wasn't about party lines or talking points. It was about something deeper, rawer, a question more primal than policy. Who do we trust to shape the future? The moderator walked out under a single spotlight and welcomed the world to the Kennedy Center. This isn't a traditional debate, she said. No podiums, no rehearsed segments, no commercial breaks, just two voices, one stage, one future. The camera panned to the left. Holt Vandermeer strode out in a slate-gray suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He smiled like a man who had been coached by 7 different consultants and still didn't believe he could lose. His team had flooded social media in the final hours with phrases like steady hand, proven track record, visionary in uncertain times. But he didn't look steady. He looked rehearsed. Then the camera turned. Karoline walked out in silence. No entourage, no makeup team fussing with her collar. Just her, dressed simply, sharply, every step deliberate. And when she reached the center of the stage, she didn't wait for the opening question. She looked directly into the camera, past the moderator, past the crowd, into the living rooms of America, and spoke first. One line, calm, clear, carved from conviction. They built a system to silence people like me, and I showed up anyway. The room froze. No fanfare, no theatrics, just the sound of collective air being pulled from 1,000 lungs. On social media, it went viral before she finished her second sentence. A phrase weaponized with truth, repeated, retweeted, echoed. Holt blinked, hard. The moderator recovered quickly, pivoting into the first question. You've both spoken about the future of artificial intelligence in American life. Mr. Vandermeer, let's begin with your vision. He launched into it. Polished, technical, buzzword heavy. A speech disguised as an answer. Integrated machine learning across infrastructure, unlocking global efficiency, privacy embedded into design layers. It was a Silicon Valley TED Talk disguised as a solution. It wasn't that he was wrong, it was that he was distant. He spoke about people like they were systems. And then Karoline spoke. Her voice didn't rise, but it reached. I'm not here to sell AI to you, she said. I'm here to ask why your children's lives are being written by lines of code they can't see, can't question, and can't opt out of. She told a story about a teenager who'd been flagged by an algorithm before his school counselor ever called home. She brought up small towns where job applications went unanswered, not because people were lazy, but because resume filters designed in a different zip code decided they weren't culturally aligned. She didn't speak in abstractions. She named people, and people remembered that. Holt countered with spreadsheets, with research trials, with stats from labs no one watching had ever heard of. Karoline countered with lived reality, with a phrase that stuck. Innovation without humanity is just disruption with a better logo. By the halfway mark, the crowd wasn't just nodding. They were leaning in. Holt tried to regain control. He brought up her inexperience. He called her well-meaning but dangerously naive. He even smirked while saying it, like he was handing the audience a pre-packaged soundbite. Karoline didn't flinch. She just turned her head toward him and asked, "If experience means knowing how to lose a generation without blinking, I'll take inexperience every time." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was devastating. The moderator tried to pivot to cybersecurity. Karoline brought it back to transparency. To most Americans, cybersecurity is a password reset and a headline about leaks, she said. But real security isn't about firewalls, it's about trust. If we don't know who's training the systems or what those systems are learning, we're not secure. We're owned. The room erupted, and Holt, for the first time on stage, visibly bristled. His answers got longer, less direct. He started talking at the room instead of with it. He dropped names of technocrats and corporate frameworks like they were spells that used to work. They didn't tonight, because Karoline didn't come to perform. She came to remind people that truth doesn't need a title, that moral clarity isn't a partisan trick, it's a decision. And millions watching felt it in their bones. Backstage, Tasha whispered to no one in particular, "She just flipped the room." By the final question, Holt looked tired, worn. His tie had been straightened twice by his handler during a break. His smile had dulled into something performative. "Final thoughts," the moderator said. 1 minute each. What do you want the future to remember about this moment? Holt gave the speech he had memorized. He talked about responsibility, progress, the careful hands of experience, the importance of realistic expectations. And then Karoline stepped forward. Just one pace, one breath. And she said that someone told the truth and didn't apologize for it. It was over. The audience didn't wait for the moderator's cue. They stood. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to say, we heard her. We believed her. And more importantly, we remembered her. That night, Holt Vandermeer's campaign team tried to do damage control. They released a statement blaming the theatrics of populism and manipulative rhetoric. They said she had ducked the technical details, but none of it stuck. Because people weren't watching for formulas. They were watching for someone real. And Karoline Leavitt had walked into the most powerful room in the country and made it feel like their room. It started with a breath, not a word, not a gesture, just a single pause, a moment held with such weight it pulled the air straight out of the room. Karoline stood at center stage, one hand lightly resting on the edge of her podium, the other holding nothing at all. She wasn't reading. She wasn't quoting. She was remembering. And then she spoke. "I was 14 when I watched my town's library close. Budget cuts, they said. Efficiency. But that library was the only place where kids without Wi-Fi could finish homework, where parents could print job applications, where seniors came just to not be alone." She looked up, steady, unblinking. They didn't cut a building. They cut connection. They cut dignity. And they called it progress. The room went still. Somewhere off camera, a pen dropped. And then she kept going. They'll tell you tech will save us. That data is smarter than compassion. That regulation slows innovation. But I'm here to ask, innovation for who? She took another breath. Because the people I've met across this country, they're not asking for flying taxis. They're asking for rent they can afford, teachers who don't quit, and water that doesn't poison their kids. That's when it happened. The moderator tried to move on. She opened her mouth to pivot, to follow the script, but she never got the chance. Because the first person stood up. Third row, center aisle. A woman in her 40s, hand over her heart, tears in her eyes. No applause, just reverence. Then the man next to her stood. Then 2 more. Then 10. Then 100. And then the room was on its feet. Mid-debate. Not at the end. Not after a closing statement. In the middle. Live. On camera. With no cue, no music, no polish. A spontaneous, unscripted, unmistakable standing ovation. Not for the billionaire. Not for the institution. For her. For the voice that said what everyone else had only dared to feel. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't bow. She didn't bask. She just nodded softly. Once. The smallest acknowledgement. And then she finished her thought. Technology is a tool, she said. Not a god, not a shield, not a substitute for justice. We built these systems, and we can rebuild them, but only if we listen, not just to engineers, not just to economists, but to the people who live with the consequences. The applause broke then, loud, uncontainable, unashamed. The camera cut to Holt. He looked like a man who had just been handed a language he couldn't read. His smile, already strained, vanished entirely. Because Holt Vandermeer hadn't prepared for this. He'd trained for stats, for logic traps, for rhetorical flourishes. He had graphs queued up, economic models lined and color-coded, catchphrases tested by 3 focus groups. But he had no defense for this. For truth that didn't ask permission. For decency that didn't need dressing up. He shifted in place, cleared his throat, tried to look unimpressed. And the crowd didn't care. Because in that moment, they weren't responding to performance. They were responding to presence. Karoline had given voice to what had been building for years. The quiet anger, the simmering disillusionment, the gnawing sense that somewhere along the way, progress stopped meaning people's lives getting better and started meaning someone else getting richer. She'd put it into words, and then she'd looked the country in the eye and dared them to feel it with her. Backstage, Tasha gripped the side of the monitor. Her voice was hoarse from whispering, "Yes," again and again. Tom stared at the data feed. Real-time engagement metrics ticking upward like stock prices in a frenzy. Every network's viewer count had just spiked. Luis said nothing, just nodded. Once. This was it. This was the moment. Later, they would say it was the night politics cracked open, the night the format lost control, the night someone without a billion-dollar war chest or a consulting firm behind her seized a room simply by telling the truth without fear. On Twitter, the trending topic wasn't just #Karoline2028, though that was there too. It was, "She made them stand." People posted videos from every angle, phone footage, live stream screen caps, close-ups of Holt's reaction. And the reactions told the story better than any anchor could. One post read, "I didn't cry until she said dignity. Then I remembered what it felt like to need help and be told to wait 6 months. She gets it." Another, "That's not a politician. That's a leader." Even her critics, those who disagreed with her platform, her positions, her tone, had to admit it. She'd done something rare. She'd broken through. And Holt? He tried to recover, tried to play the long game. He leaned into stability, into experience. He referenced global indexes, slipped in veiled critiques about Karoline being emotional and not ready for complex decisions. He even got one mild laugh when he made a joke about building systems that scale, not speeches that trend. But it was over. The tide had turned, not because she'd landed a zinger or outperformed on points, but because she'd done the one thing none of them could fake. She felt like the future, and the crowd stood for that. Not because she asked them to, but because they needed to. Because standing was the only way to say, "We see you, we hear you, and we believe you." The standing ovation didn't end at the Kennedy Center. It followed them out into the night, into the living rooms and phone screens and comment sections of a country that had finally heard something it hadn't realized it was starving for. A voice that didn't flinch. A leader who didn't barter clarity for applause. By sunrise, the headlines were already different. Vandermeer wobbles, Leavitt commands. From underdog to frontrunner, a debate that changed everything. Tech mogul faces reckoning after Leavitt's mic drop moment. The billionaire wasn't trending anymore. She was. Back at Holt's headquarters, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was fiscal. It was visible. The first investor pulled out before the sun came up. An old-school industrialist who had been uneasy about Holt's move from business into soft power in the first place. He didn't issue a press release. He didn't tweet. He just sent a terse email to the board and moved his money elsewhere. Then came the second blow. One of Vandermeer's AI partners, an influential research lab with billions in venture backing, suspended their collaboration. Pending internal review, the statement read. But everyone knew what it meant. The association had become radioactive. By midday, a half-dozen others followed. In 24 hours, Holt lost $187 million in pledged support. His team was unraveling too. Lita Voss resigned, citing misalignment of values. Kane Mercer hadn't been seen in the building since the night of the debate. And inside the once imposing glass tower of Vandermeer Strategies, staffers began quietly wiping his name off pitch decks. Holt watched it all unfold from the 88th floor, arms crossed, jaw tight. "This is just a dip," he muttered to no one. "Fame fades. Attention spans are shorter than ever." But for the first time in years, he didn't sound like a man predicting the future. He sounded like a man hoping it would stop happening. The internal Slack channels at his firm were chaos. Leaked messages painted a picture of panic, finger-pointing, and more than a few staffers openly asking if they should start sending out resumes. His reputation hadn't been dented. It had tilted. And Karoline hadn't said a single word about him since the debate ended. She didn't have to, because the world was saying it for her. Across town, in a much smaller building with no marble floors or catered kitchens, Karoline Leavitt was trying to drink her coffee in peace. But every sip was interrupted by a new message, a new call, a new alert. The email subject lines alone read like something out of a movie. Invitation. Keynote at Davos 2026. Interest in book deal. Penguin Random House. Jon Stewart wants you on next week. Request, dinner with Senator Macklin. She's a fan. Private meeting. Apple CEO. Advisory role? Tasha was flipping through physical letters now. Actual, handwritten notes delivered by courier. "Karoline, someone sent you roses and a thank you card for talking about rural broadband," she said, holding it up like evidence. Luis came in with polling data. He didn't even bother with an intro. Favorability up 42 points with voters under 35, across parties. He pointed at a graph. And this is insane. You're polling higher than most sitting senators among independents. Karoline looked at the numbers, then at the pile of invitations, then at the messages still flooding in. And she said the only thing that made sense. I didn't win anything. Tasha blinked. Excuse me? I didn't win. Not a seat. Not a race. Just a microphone. She sat back in her chair, eyes focused on nothing. They're all rushing in now. But where were they before? Watching, Louise said. Waiting. They saw someone walk into Holt Vandermeer's house and rearrange the furniture, Tasha added. They're not just reacting to you, they're adjusting around you. That's what made it real. It wasn't just applause. It wasn't viral. It was gravity, the kind that bends plans, redirects capital, forces the powerful to rewrite their forecasts. Karoline had become that force, and now she had decisions to make. Every major political group wanted to align with her. Progressive coalitions, reformist centrists, even libertarian tech skeptics were trying to find common ground. Her inbox was a mosaic of questions disguised as offers. Would she run? Would she endorse? Would she build something new? And underneath all of it, the unspoken pressure of fame. To brand herself, monetize the moment, package the message. She rejected half the calls, delayed the rest. I don't want to cash in, she told her team. I want to cash out of this system that rewards charisma and punishes conscience. But even she knew the moment wouldn't last forever. Fame never does. That night, she went home alone for the first time in days. No cameras, no strategy meetings, no donor briefings, just her, standing at the kitchen sink, looking out into the dark. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Violet Chen, the MIT engineer who'd once turned down a job at Vandermeer Labs. What you did wasn't politics, it was architecture. Let me know if you ever want to build something. Karoline smiled, a real one. Because for the first time since the challenge began, the road ahead didn't look narrow. It looked wide open. She didn't know exactly what she would build yet. A movement, a platform, a candidacy. But she knew the foundation it would stand on. Truth, clarity, and the simple radical act of showing up anyway. Across the country, the headlines continued to evolve. Not populist firebrand anymore. Not former staffer turned upstart. Now it was Karoline Leavitt, architect. A new kind of influence. The voice Holt tried to contain, now reshaping the conversation. Because while he tried to win the moment, she had built a movement. And movements don't need invitations. They make their own doors. The irony wasn't lost on him. 1 year to the day since the challenge, since the debate, since everything. And Holt Vandermeer, former architect of the future, curator of innovation, oracle to the elite, sat in the back row of the United Nations Assembly Hall, anonymous, uninvited, and most painfully of all, unnecessary. He didn't wear a name badge, didn't walk the blue carpet or speak to the press. He'd arrived through a side entrance, escorted not by handlers or interns, but by silence. He was just another man in a dark suit now, just another face in the sea of diplomats, dignitaries, and journalists, with their eyes all pointed in the same direction. Toward the stage, toward her, Karoline Leavitt. She stood at the central podium of the UN General Assembly like she'd been born there. No teleprompter, no speech folder, just a single card in her hand with a few scribbled lines. More reminder than script. She didn't need anything else. The hall was full. Overflow seating had been added. The live stream was being translated into 42 languages. And across the world, people who didn't usually care about global politics were watching this one because she was at the microphone. The woman Holt had once tried to outtalk, outmaneuver, outlast, now stood where no tech mogul ever had. Not in the shadows of power, at the center of it. Technology, she began, has outpaced trust. There it was again. That voice, calm, grounded, but carrying something no algorithm could replicate. Conviction forged in public, in pain, in truth. In the last decade, we have built systems that know more about our children than we do. We've allowed code to make decisions that used to belong to courts. We've replaced accountability with automation. She paused, letting it settle. Not because we're evil, but because we were told it was the price of progress. Back row. Holt's jaw tightened. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It wasn't thunder and fireworks. It was clarity, the kind that makes power uncomfortable because it reminds people of what they gave away in the name of convenience. Karoline looked out over the crowd. Prime ministers, secretaries of state, Nobel laureates. And she kept going. "I stand here not to condemn technology," she said. "I stand here because I believe in it. But belief without boundaries becomes blind faith. And blind faith has no place in the architecture of the future." She moved closer to the microphone, her voice softening just enough. Our generation has inherited a crossroads. We can continue optimizing for control, or we can choose to design for dignity. We can build systems that serve markets, or systems that serve people. The audience was rapt. Not one phone screen glowed, not one cough, just silence. Stillness. After the speech, delegates swarmed her. Cameras flashed. A child from a refugee education program handed her a small folded note that said in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for protecting us." A year ago, Karoline Leavitt was just another name in the margins. A voice too sharp for comfort, too honest for the algorithms. Too disruptive for the institutions that preferred their futures predictable. Now she's not just a name. She's a reference point, a before and after. In classrooms, students study the moment she made a global stage feel like a kitchen table. In boardrooms, executives invoke her words not to impress shareholders, but to remember what accountability looks like. And in homes across the world, parents tell their kids, "You don't have to wait for permission to speak the truth. Look at Karoline. She didn't build an empire, she built a mirror. And in doing so, forced power to see itself clearly, for the first time in decades. But she didn't do it by yelling, or blaming, or branding herself into a slogan. She did it by showing up, by refusing to stay silent, by reminding us that courage isn't a costume, it's a commitment. And maybe that's the legacy that matters most. Not the accolades, not the applause, but the spark she left behind. Because movements don't end with one voice, they begin with it. And thanks to Karoline Leavitt, an entire generation now knows. They were never asking for too much. They were just being told to ask for less. Until now. If Karoline's story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe that integrity still wins. And don't forget to check out the next video on your screen, because the future's already listening, and it's louder than ever.